Okay, so this second section of chapter 5 or module 5, we're going to look at no taxation without representation. Have we heard that before? All right, you probably heard it in civics, maybe, but this is a time period leading up to the American Revolution. After the French and Indian War, there was like a 10-15 year period where things were really, really hard between the British and the colonists that were living in America. That term, no taxation, that's saying you can't tax us. The colonists were saying you can't tax us without us having some kind of say in the decision making, and that's where the representation comes from. So your colonists were living in this time period, again, remember, where they had enjoyed like 150 years of self-government, meaning they could make their decisions for themselves. And now all of a sudden the British are saying that they can't do that. And so the colonists are upset. They don't want to pay these taxes. Remember, they didn't even want the French and Indian War to begin with. And so this is just kind of a snowball effect after the French and Indian War. You guys know what that means. And a snowball is rolling down the hill. What happens to it? It gets bigger, right? Collects and collects and collects. And that's kind of what's happening with these harsh feelings between the British and the colonists that live in the American colonies. So just a little recap for us. Remember, during the 1750s, the British and the French, they both wanted land in the Ohio River Valley. So they were fighting over that land, eventually leads to the French and Indian War. 1754 was its first clash. Officially, war begins in 1756. But remember, the nations are also fighting in Europe as well. What's the other name for the French and Indian War? Yeah, the 7 Years' War. And again, remember, they both wanted to control this area. The natives say they're going to stay neutral, but end up helping whom? The French. Remember, they had a long relationship with them, a long friendly relationship. And so it was only kind of natural that the natives were going to help them. Eventually, the British win the war with the signing of the Treaty of Paris of 1763. And Great Britain now controls all of that land east of the Mississippi River, and that's when they pass the proclamation line that we just talked about. Remember, 2 reasons for passing that. Great Britain wanted to tax the colonists because they had a lot of debt from the war, and they wanted to try and avoid another war with the natives by making sure that the colonists did not move west. And so this line is there, but eventually, or not eventually, but what the colonists do with that proclamation line is they pretty much just ignore it. And that should be where you start typing. Everybody with me? Did I skip one? Okay, I'm just making sure. This guy here, this is King George III in England. He was the king during this time of the French and Indian War and also leading into the American Revolution. Just to give you kind of like a, I don't know, just some context of him. He was like in his 20s during the Revolution, like his mid-20s. So he's like super young, also a little cray-cray. They're pretty sure he had like a really bad temper. And so some people historians think today that he might have had like bipolar disease or something like that. Sarah? I don't know the answer. If you want to Google it for us, you can let me know. I don't know. I'm pretty young though, because he was in his 20s during the Revolution, which is still like 10 years from this point. And so it was pretty, he was pretty young, also pretty cuckoo, to put it in a nice way. Okay, so after the French and Indian War, proclamation line of 1763 is passed, but that is really just the beginning when it comes to new laws and things like that that are passed for the colonists. So in your notes, you should have this table. It should be there, and I think I updated it. I may have forgotten to underline some things, but they're there for you guys. All of these laws we're going to discuss today. We're going to look at each one of these. Some of them might sound familiar to you. Some of them, it might be the first time you've ever heard of them. But these are all laws and taxes that were passed after the French and Indian War in order to pay off the debt from the war. All right. And it wasn't all instantaneous, but it was close enough together that the colonists felt like they needed to do something about it. And the colonists didn't have a say in a lot of what was going on. And so that was a big reason why they did not like what was happening. Yes, you can.
Miss Givens.
Yes.
So they were doing all these acts so they could pay off the war?
Yes. Remember, they had a lot of debt from the French and Indian War. So the best way they figured they could pay off the war was tax the colonists. So they taxed them on basically everything that they used in their everyday lives.
Okay.
Yes. So I'll give you guys a second to do that, and then I'll go through those, and then we'll talk about them. Okay, so again, the proclamation line, the colonists have to stay in the colonies. It was passed to make sure that the colonists were there to pay taxes. The next one was 1764. It was the Sugar Act. Sugar was big in the colonies because tea was big in the colonies. The Sugar Act, again, like I was saying, the colonists drank a lot of tea. It was culturally what they did. The Sugar Act actually lowered the tax on sugar and molasses. But what it did do, something that was just kind of added in there separately, was that it allowed officers to seize goods from smugglers without going to court. So basically it was like you're guilty because we said you're guilty, not the whole like you're innocent until proven guilty. It was more like you're guilty until proven innocent. Smuggling was a big thing during this time period. What's smuggling? Have we heard the word before? Maybe we just don't know what it means. Yeah, so like smuggling, you're like sneaking or stealing. In this sense, the smuggling that was going on was people would like sneak goods into the colonies so they wouldn't have to pay taxes, right? Because they felt like the taxes were so high, or they just didn't want to have to pay them in general. And so people smuggled a lot of things into the colonies, and the British knew it was going on. It was just a matter of like catching them. And so before the Sugar Act, you would have to go to court to prove that they were smuggling and then take the goods from them and make them pay. With the Sugar Act, your British soldiers could just take the goods and make the people pay anyway, without having to go to court for that. We'll talk more about that in a second. The Stamp Act, it was a tax on all printed materials to show proof of payment. So it wasn't like an ink stamp. It was more like an imprint. Have you guys ever done that before, where it like where you could like feel like the stamp on the paper? It's more like it like makes an indentation in the paper. So that's what that was for. So it would be like newspapers, pamphlets, any kind of printed material, there had to be a stamp on. The Quartering Act, in the same year, colonists must give quarters. That's another, not like 25 cents, but quarters, like food and shelter to British soldiers if they came knocking on their door asking for that. The Declaratory Act was in 1766 that basically told the colonists that Parliament, which was the governing body in England, in Great Britain, had the right to make any and all decisions for the colony. So anything that dealt with the colonies, Parliament would make that decision, not the colonists, which angered the colonists because they were so used to self-governing, right? And then the last one was the Townshend Acts. The Townshend Acts taxed imported goods. What's an import or an imported good? Yeah, something coming into the colonies. An export is something going out. Okay, so an import is something coming from somewhere else. So the Townshend Acts taxed imported goods, and colonists were taxed locally, basically on their everyday items like paint, glass, paper, tea, and anything else you used on a daily basis, you were taxed on. All right. To us, taxes don't seem so crazy, like we're used to that. To the colonists, they were also used to taxes, but they were used to having a say in what their taxes were. They were also used to seeing the benefits of the taxes. So like in Tallahassee, who's been to Cascades Park before? Have you guys been? Okay. So you've been to Cascades Park before, and that park is a result of taxes paid, right? We see those taxes going to work towards something. Who likes to drive on nice smooth roads in town, right? That is tax dollars. Any of those parks, who goes to Tom Brown Park for anything ever? Okay, so that's taxpayer money. So we get to see the benefits. The problem with the colonists, for them, is they weren't getting to see any of the benefits of the taxes. And so they had a big problem with that, which I don't blame them. So we're going to go through each of these taxes kind of quickly, just so you can kind of know what each of them we're going through. But paper was one of the most heavily taxed items through the Stamp Act. For a pamphlet or a newspaper larger than one whole sheet, the Stamp Act imposed a duty or a tax, that's another name for a tax, of 1 shilling per page and 2 shillings for every advertisement. A shilling is just like a denomination of money. Instead of like dollars, they would say shillings. That's just kind of what they called their money. It wouldn't be in the same like value as ours. But that meant a 35-page printed on both sides issue of a magazine with 10 advertisements. Today would have been 186 pounds and 98 cents. I don't know how you say it. We'll just say like 187 pounds. That's what that funny little L shape is for. Or in terms of our dollars, $293.56 just for the tax. That doesn't include like the cost, right? So how much is a magazine today? Like $5? I don't know, right? So your magazine costs $5, but the taxes will round up $294. Who's buying a magazine for $300? Anybody? Is that magazine made of gold? Yeah, right. So that is what it would have been for us. Also keep in mind, the taxes that were being put on the colonists in America were much lower than what the taxes were actually in Great Britain. They were actually paying way more. But again, the biggest thing that the colonists had was, the problem they had was they weren't able to have a say in anything. Okay. Next, we're still on paper here. So nearly $300 for a magazine is kind of a bargain to the colonists, considering that they had to pay around $235 for a single sheet of diploma paper under the Stamp Act. So let's say you're graduating from high school or you're graduating from college. I have my, they're around the corner, but my 2 degrees on the wall back there. Sarah can probably see them, but and you guys in the back can probably see them, but they're in a big frame. But just for the piece of paper that they're printing the diploma on, you had to pay $235. So any paper, parchment used for any kind of certificate at the time, what just the tax on that was $235 roughly. We'll just round up. Okay. Obviously I paid way more for my education than $235. But if it were like, hey, get this piece of paper that says you did this for $235, I don't know that I would do it. They like sent me that in the mail after I graduated. And then my parents bought me that nice frame, but I don't know that I would have paid $235. Again, under the Stamp Act, a tariff is a tax on imported goods, okay, of 10 shillings was added to every piece of dice sold. All right, so in today's economy, that would leave you paying like $58 for a pair of dice, for 2 little dice. $58, just, you know, for tax purposes. The penalty for being caught selling an illegal pair of dice, basically, the one you didn't pay the tax, you know, a pair of dice you didn't pay the tax on, would cost you 10 pounds per die, or 20 pounds for the pair, meaning that if you were caught with an illegal pair of dice, you would have to pay over $2,300 in fines. Anybody gonna smuggle dice or playing cards? We're gonna talk about cards in just a second. Yes, like dice. Yeah.
Miss Gibbons.
Yes, Freddie.
Were alcoholic drinks like taxed the most?
We're gonna talk about that in a second.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but yeah, so gambling, I say gambling, like card games and stuff like that were big. Obviously, they didn't have TV, they don't have phones, no social media, no TikTok, right? And so they have something else to do with their time to actually like talk to each other. And so like card games and any kind of games with dice or anything like that were really big. And so any way that the British felt like they could find to tax people, they did. Playing cards. So how much are playing cards today? $5. Okay, yeah, maybe that, right? Yeah. And a lot of times you can find them like in the little, like where the candy is at Walmart, right? In the little, by the checkout lines, right? They're like right there. So like maybe $5. So each deck of playing cards sold in the colonies was charged an extra shilling, or today an extra $5.87. Bless you. Under the Stamp Act. So whatever the cost was, the tax would have been today $5.87. It doesn't, right? So so it doesn't seem like a lot, but you know, with talking about the dice on the last slide, you know, you can buy a deck of cards for $5 or under, but if you were caught selling or caught with an illegal pair of playing cards, or counterfeit cards, one that you didn't pay the tax on because it's a printed material under the Stamp Act, again, your penalty is that 20 pounds there. And again, that's that $2,300 like fine. So you could end up paying like $2,300 for a pair of, or for a deck of playing cards. Is it worth it? Some of the colonists felt like it was. Next one, a stamp duty or the tax under the Stamp Act was 4 pence, which is the equivalent today of, we'll just say $2, was added to 1-year calendars and almanacs printed in the colony. So that tax wasn't so bad, right? Depending on what the cost of your calendar was, you also had to pay a $2 tax on that. Under the Townshend Acts, a duty of 3 pence, which is about, we'll say $1.50, was added to every pound of tea sold in the colonies. Why would the tax on tea be so cheap? a lot of people drank tea, and so they knew they were going to make money on tea. And they knew if that tax was super high, then people wouldn't what? Then yeah, people wouldn't buy tea, at least from them. The Sugar Act of 1764, it imposed a tax of £2, 19 shillings and 9 pence, or in terms of our money today, $350.80 on every hundredweight, or we'll just say 112 pounds of foreign coffee sold in the colonies. Foreign coffee, because they wanted the tax on foreign goods to be more than the tax on English goods. So people would buy what? English goods, right? So even today, things from other countries are a little more expensive because we have to pay taxes on foreign goods. Now well, it depends, right? And that's what I was about to say. Like, making it in other countries is cheaper, right? But if there's something that like we can't make here ourselves and we have to get it from another country, it's going to be more expensive. Does that make sense? Okay. This tax is a lot when the tariff on, or the tax on British coffee was like $41.10. So the tax on foreign coffee was we'll round up $351 versus British coffee that was $41. So if you were like a business owner or something, or you had like a little a coffee shop, they might call it like a pub or something where you could get coffee, not just like alcohol stuff, or a restaurant, or a lot of people owned like bed and breakfast type places, right? So anything like that. Like your normal person is not going to buy 112 pounds of coffee for their house. Maybe you will, I don't know. 100 weight, again, that is 112 pounds of foreign white sugar. The tax for that was around $130. And under the Sugar Act, it actually increased the number of items taxed, but lowered the tax on sugar and molasses. Again, kind of going along with the tea, it was cheaper with tea and sugar because they knew they were going to get money on that. So back to Freddie's question, with the Sugar Act, every ton of wine, the growth of the Madeira. So this was like European wine, this was like Caribbean wine. If you watch Pirates of the Caribbean, sometimes they refer to this wine, but it was just I don't know, it was like an exotic wine, so people wanted to drink it. But the tariff of £7, which is the equivalent of $805, was put on any of that kind of foreign wine. 14 times more than wine that was from Europe. So like France and England and Spain.
Please excuse this interruption. By now, everyone should be able to get on Canvas. I know that Dia Stevens has sent out an email regarding how to do this. Ms. Hallam has provided directions, and Ms. Clary has provided directions on our website for our DA students. So everyone should be able to access Canvas at this point. Thank you.
So to answer your question, Freddie, it depended on where your alcohol came from. If it was not European or British alcohol, it was going to be taxed a lot more because they wanted people to buy British stuff. Because remember, the whole reason for these taxes is Great Britain is what? They're poor from war. What war? Not the Revolutionary War. We're not there yet. 7 Years War or the French and Indian War. Also under the Stamp Act, the paper on which your license to sell wine was printed was taxed a tax of £4, which we'll just round up to $470. So you had to have a license to sell the alcohol, and that just that piece of paper, the tax on the piece of paper, not on the license itself, but the piece of paper that says you're allowed to, was $470 in our money today. Anybody have $400 just sitting around? $500? Yeah, no? Share with me if you do. So this next picture, this is what some of your stamps would have looked like. So not necessarily like a rubber stamp, but like the indentions, like the impressions on the paper. And that's just proof that you did pay the tax on whatever that printed material was. These pictures here are showing kind of the Quartering Act and the Sugar Act at the beginning. Remember, the Sugar Act let them take goods, but the Quartering Act, you had to let a soldier in your house. Today, I think it's the Third Amendment. Is it the Third Amendment? I should have gone back and looked at that. But we have an amendment today that it's the No Quartering of Soldiers Act, right? We're not forced to house soldiers in our homes if we don't want to. And that amendment comes straight from this time period when British soldiers would just like basically knock on the door and said, give me your bed, give me your food, because I need a place to stay. And so people didn't have a choice but to let them in. Okay, here we go. Now we're back, ready to type. All the money collected from these taxes that we just talked about went straight to Great Britain. The colonists wanted to see money, help improve their lives in the colonies. They actually like fought in the war, and they wanted to see the benefits of fighting in the war. And so they were pretty upset. You also had George Grenville. He was like one of the British officials that was in the colonies. And a lot of what's happening, these taxes, they're all over the colonies, but in the New England area in Massachusetts, it's kind of like the epicenter of where all this is happening. So like New York, Boston, those areas, they're big trading centers. And so the people there are kind of feeling the British more and more. But George Grenville, what he does is he creates something called the Writs of Assistance. The Writs of Assistance, what it does, or what they do, these laws let officers go into people's houses without permission to search for smuggled goods. So essentially today, if any, authority wants to come into your home to search for anything, what do they have to have? They have to have a search warrant, right? And that warrant has to be issued by a judge. And there has to be significant evidence in order to get that warrant in the first place. They can't just say, I have a bad feeling about this person, so I need to go look. They have to provide something kind of concrete that shares this. Sarah and Brianna, make sure you guys are awake. Thank you. Can't tell if your heads are down that way. So these laws let officers go into people's homes without permission to look for smuggled goods. And so it's kind of like a permanent search warrant for everyone in the colonies. It also created courts where people did not receive fair trials with juries because the British officers were the juries. Today, our court system is set up where, you have the right to a trial by jury of your peers, right? And so the people that are involved in the jury have nothing to do with your life. Like your friends aren't allowed on the jury or anything like that. What was happening now with the British officers in charge was they were the ones that were like accusing the people of smuggling. And so were you ever going to win if you were going against British officers on the jury? No. And so they weren't fair trials. None of that. And so the colonists did not like the writs of assistance. So their reaction to the writs of assistance and also against the Stamp Act was protesting. And there were different ways that they protested, but a big reason or a big way they protested at first was peaceful, okay? Patrick Henry was responsible for creating protests against the Stamp Act. What he did, he was from Virginia, and what he did is he persuaded the Burgesses, the House of Burgesses in Virginia, to write a resolution or a formal opinion to Parliament, to the King, saying that only Virginians could tax Virginians and Parliament could not tax Virginians. Okay, we're still colonies at this point. So the colonies are all kind of operating separately. They quickly realize that they probably need to get together in terms of these taxes to fight against Parliament. So eventually they do. Patrick Henry also came up with the phrase, no taxation without representation. This was a big motto for the colonists during this time period. It was something that was chanted in the streets. It was, something that was a part of protests throughout this time period leading up to the Revolutionary War. Basically, this phrase said and meant that Parliament didn't have the right to make laws for the colonists. Them being taxed without a say in Parliament was going against their tradition of self-government. They had been enjoying this time of making their own laws and creating their own taxes for like 100 years. And now all of a sudden someone's telling them they can't do that. And so to the colonists, it seemed super unfair. To the British, and maybe it's to the fault of the British, kind of just leaving the colonies alone for a long time. It was like doing a 180, going the complete opposite direction of like, we were all kind of working together and we were letting you do what you want to, but now we need you and we need to tax you. But the colonists, they didn't really have a problem paying taxes. It was more the representation part that they had a problem with. Does that make sense? Everybody with me? Okay. Would you like to have a say in things that happen to you? Right? And that's where the colonists were. Some other ways that your colonists protested, you had a group called the Sons of Liberty that was started by John Adams, Samuel Adams, right? They were brother or cousins. I think they're actually cousins. A lot of people that you have heard of, Paul Revere, they were part of the Sons of Liberty. What the Sons of Liberty would do is they would protest different acts. At this point, the Sons of Liberty was born out of hatred for the Stamp Act. But they would create effigies of royal officials to burn and march through the streets. Effigy was one of your vocabulary words. What's an effigy? Do you remember seeing the word? What's an effigy? EFFIGY. Yes, go ahead. Yeah, it was like a dummy or like a stuffed figure that represented, in this case, royal officials that they would like burn and like beat up in the streets to show how much they hated the British, right? They weren't actually burning real people. So they created a figure to do that. But a lot of times they would dress it up in some kind of British looking uniform and do that just to kind of show their distaste. The movie The Patriot, it's pretty old. I think I mentioned it last week too. They have an effigy of King George that they like burn in that movie. Has like a crown on it, kind of deal. Patrick Henry also helped create something called the Stamp Act Congress. Rather than like burning things in the street or doing things more on that end, the Stamp Act Congress was a more diplomatic way that the colonists felt like they could share their opinions with the British and specifically Parliament. But the Stamp Act Congress, they drafted a petition stating that the colonies could only be taxed by their own assemblies, meaning they could only be taxed by their own governments. So only the House of Burgesses could create taxes for Virginia. Only the government in Massachusetts could create taxes for Massachusetts, and so forth with all the rest of the colonies. Due to this petition, in March of 1766, the Stamp Act was repealed. What does that mean? If a law is repealed, it can be passed and then it can be repealed. What does that mean? Yeah, taken back, right? And so like kind of canceled out. So in March of 1766, the Stamp Act is repealed. So no more Stamp Act. You don't have to pay those taxes on all those printed materials. The colonists are like, that was really easy. I don't know that we trust Parliament to like not tax us again on something. The same year in 1766, Parliament passes the Declaratory Act. What was the Declaratory Act that we talked about a few minutes ago? Scroll back up. Someone scroll back up and tell me what the Declaratory Act was.
Parliament had rights to make any and all blank something from the colonies.
Okay, Parliament Parliament had control to make any and all what for the colonies? Well, not just taxes. Yeah, decisions, right? Did we not get that part in our notes? Make sure you get that. Parliament could make any and all decisions for the colonies without the colonies having a say. That was the Declaratory Act. Everybody with me? Right. So the word in there is like declare. And Parliament was declaring that they were in charge, not the colonies. And the colonies are like, whoa, wait a minute. We've made our own laws. We don't like these laws. And then a year later, the Townshend Acts were passed. What were the Townshend Acts? Go back to your chart. What did it say? Okay. Tax your imported goods and what else? Your everyday items. So basically, they repealed the Stamp Act that just taxed what? That was the Sugar Act. Yeah. What were the stamps on? Your printed materials, right? So the Stamp Act taxed printed materials. They repealed that and they're like, nope, you don't have to pay that tax anymore. And then they say, oh, guess what? We get to make all the decisions for you under the Declaratory Act. And then after that, they passed the Townshend Acts, which basically taxed everything that the colonists used all the time, every day. Everybody with me? Mm-hmm. So the Townshend Acts were kind of like punishment for trying to tell Parliament what to do with the Stamp Act Congress.
It's given.
Yes.
Did some people leave at this point?
Yeah, there were people leaving to go to other areas. The problem is all the colonies were being taxed. The people that protested the most were in the New England area. If you went to Canada, the British now control Canada. I remember our map from last week. If you go
Yeah.
back to England, if you go back to Great Britain, like you're still paying taxes. So like, where are you going to go?
Yeah.
And a lot of people were born in the colonies at this point. So like, I don't know. It was a hard decision, but some people did leave.
Oh.
Went off the grid. Everybody okay here? Good? Okay. So this is just a picture of the Stamp Act Congress, you know, them trying to draft that petition to send to Parliament. All right, our last slide here, right? Yeah. Basically, at this point, anything that Great Britain did, like law-wise or tax-wise, the colonists were going to be completely against. They weren't okay with it. They weren't going to follow it. They were going to continue to smuggle, remember, like sneak in goods so they didn't have to pay taxes. They truly and deeply felt like only their own representatives had the right to tax them, because they had enjoyed that representation. They had enjoyed having a say in their government, and now they didn't have that. Other ways that the colonists would protest was by boycotting. What does that mean? Let me use it. Let me continue that sentence. Colonists would boycott during the Stamp Act, all British goods. If you're boycotting, yeah, basically they chose not to buy British goods if they could. They would find other goods to buy, or really they smuggled a lot of things. Is there anything that you've ever like protested, like, I'm not going to eat at this restaurant, or I'm not going to buy from this store, right? And so that's boycotting. And that's what a lot of the colonists did. Women also protested and organized their own groups. Just like you had the Sons of Liberty, women organized themselves into the Daughters of Liberty. What the Daughters of Liberty did, they didn't like go around with like effigies, like burning them in the street, but they urged Americans to produce goods that were only before available from Great Britain. So now they're saying like, hey, let's become economically independent of Great Britain. Let's show them that we don't need them and that we can produce our own goods just as well as they can. Took a little bit longer in the colonies. At this point in like the 1750s and 60s, Great Britain is going through their industrial revolution, where they're beginning to use like water power and different things. The colonies are about 50 years behind that. And so you don't have as widespread like production as you do in Great Britain, but groups like the Daughters of Liberty were urging Americans to do that.